is I can definitely find these people everywhere in these major traditions that I've mentioned. And then what you can do is you can begin to empirically study them. So now let's take that assumption. Forget about the scale. If you can punch it up on the internet or email me and I'll send you the scales. And there's many versions, but let's just look at what psychologists can do with that. So I want to just do two things because I want to get to the Good Friday experiment. What I'm going to do first is tell you 3 simple empirical facts from over 20 years of empirical studies with the M scale. First is mysticism is common, it's not pathological, it's reported in all of the great faith traditions, and we can study its empirical antecedents and its empirical consequences. So the fact, is there such a thing as mysticism, and can we assess the report of it? The answer is yes. The second thing is, what does it have to do necessarily with religion in the sense of faith traditions? And here I want to go to something that's important. Psychologists are fond of taking huge masses of data that has reached a particular consensual conclusion and then simply abandoning them and ignoring them as new research strategies come into play. But one of the things that was a key factor in the establishment of the empirical measurement-based discipline of the psychology of religion was the work of Gordon Allport. And Gordon Allport was a psychologist of religion before there was the new psychology of religion. He was at Harvard University, and he was interested in a puzzling problem. And the problem he was interested in was prejudice. And the problem he had is he was a good Methodist. And he said, what we ought to do is recognize that people who are believers in Methodism, who are good Protestant, religious people, should be the least religious people, the least prejudiced people. We'll get to Freud later. The least prejudiced people, right, of anyone in the United States. But then he was also a good empirical scientist. So when he assessed the relationship of religion to prejudice, he was dumbfounded. Because it turns out that the most bigoted people in the United States, focusing upon, in his case, ethnic prejudice, were people who were church attenders. And Allport was just distraught. But he knew what to do. And this is what I tell my students. Whenever you get empirical data that doesn't match your theory, right, don't change your theory. Mess with the data. Okay? Now, and that's what he did. He said, okay, the major way we assess people's religious beliefs, do you attend church, synagogue, mosque? He's mainly looking at Christians, so do you attend church? And he said, he came up with great insight. People attend church for all kinds of reasons. So he said, it's not whether you attend church, it's what's your motivation for attending church. And he had worked with Allport, Vernon on scales of values. So he said, let's make a measure of the motivation that people have for going to church. And he said, there's 2 basic motivations you can have, and it works for anything. And I'll make it real short. One, you can do something for extrinsic reasons. I teach at a university that's largely first-generation college students. And I know why they're in college. Not because they're dying to find truth, justice, and beauty, right? But because, like, they want a degree and a better job. So many people go to college because they're trying to advance their education to get a better job so they can be unemployed at a higher level, right? Now, what's good about that is that's good, right? There's nothing wrong with it. But there's another group of people that are intrinsically motivated. They don't want to do X in order to get Y, right? They just want to do X because they love X. So there's 2 kinds of people that go to church. 2 kinds of people that go to mosque. People that go because they believe intrinsically and devoutly, and that's why there's nothing else. Or people who go extrinsically. Because, for instance, Many people we know the literature on the conversion research, when they get children, want their children to go to a Christian Bible camp because there's less drugs there. Right? And that's okay. But that's an extrinsic reason. You're a businessman. You want to go to church to make new contacts. When you break out the people who are religious for extrinsic reasons, who are 90% of the people who are religious, they're extremely prejudiced. But when you break out people who are religious for intrinsic reasons, 10%, they have the lowest prejudice of any rate, of any group of people in the United States. So people in Allport's sense who are religious because they live and internalize their religion are not prejudiced. And people who are religious for other reasons are the kind of people that give religion its bad name. So here's what I did. I want to get into the Good Friday experiment in just 3 steps. Here's the first step. We relate people's report of mystical experience to not the content of their religious belief, but to the motivation for being religious. So I can give my scales to Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, but I also have a way to assess the Allport's measures whether their motivation is extrinsic or intrinsic. And here's what we find. And I'm summarizing now 75 studies in a real short one phrase. People who are extrinsic have the lowest rates of mystical experience, not only relative to religious people, but to other groups of people. And that's why there are people who, in the world, simply don't attend to mystical type experiences, may not have such types of experiences, and they're telling the truth. But intrinsic people score exceptionally high. And it doesn't matter if you're a follower of Islam, or if you're a follower of Christ, or you're a follower of Judaism. It doesn't make any difference, because you recognize that same experience that's embedded within your tradition and is part of the living force that keeps you in your faith tradition. But there raises a problem. And here's the problem that we're going to get to when we get to the Good Friday study. Allport's scale raises a problem that all psychologists have with self-report measures. It's not that self-report measures aren't important. In fact, there are many things that can only be achieved by self-report measures. But what is important is that people can lie. So how do you know? So Allport said there are some people, when you give them a scale asking about religious things, he said there are some people that he called indiscriminately pro. Like, religion is a good thing, I'm for religion, yes. They don't make distinctions. And that's okay, because there are other people that are indiscriminately anti, the new, doctrine kind of atheists. That has to do with religion, anything to do with religion is bad, so he's for it low. So when you give the report of mystical experience to people that are in these 4 categories now, either intrinsically religious, indiscriminately pro-religious, extrinsically religious, or indiscriminately anti-religious, here's what you find. The intrinsic and the indiscriminately pro people score the same. They're both high. The extrinsic and the indiscriminately anti-people score low. And I think I can separate them out. I can tell who's falsifying and who's denying experience. So here's what I do. I interview people, and there's a neat thing that I got from a friend of mine, actually from the CIA, but they're very sophisticated voice stress analyzers. And you all know what it is when people are talking, and they're claiming to you they're not nervous or they're not upset, their voice is cracking, and they're standing there shaking, and they're leaving a little puddle, and you begin to think things like, I think you're nervous, right? And if you're nervous, there's a reason for that. So we interview people extensively about their mystical experiences based upon these 4 categories. And here's the summary of what we find. People who are intrinsic or able to explore and struggle with their experience and show no sign of voice stress. But people who are indiscriminately pro describe experiences, stumble, it doesn't sound authentic, and they show immense stress. So what I think they are is trying to present a religious life, that in fact they don't have. In a more flamboyant sense, they're simply lying. But the most interesting group are the extrinsic and indiscriminately anti-people. Because the extrinsic people, when talking about mystical experiences, I don't know what you're talking about, have anything like that, it doesn't interest me, and they don't show any stress. They're people who simply have no deep spiritual life, and that's just fine. But there's a group of indiscriminately anti-people who are amazingly interesting because they deny that they've had any mystical experiences, they're struggling, and they show immense signs of stress. And those are the people that get us to the Good Friday experience. Because those are the people that are saying religion's all bunk, mystical experience is all bunk, but they're struggling with what I think are experiences that they're having and trying to put down. So what happens with the Good Friday experiment? There was, in the 60s, an interesting phenomenon. You might put it with the drug revolution, the hippies, in a book by Harvey Cox called Turning Leaves, the so-called psychedelic revolution. And the psychedelic revolution started as an interesting religious movement with individuals taking certain types of drugs, particularly LSD, and as we'll see with the Harvard studies, psilocybin, and having two kinds of possible experiences. A sense of an alteration in the way they experienced the world when taking this very minor drug substance. And if that were all there was to it, it wouldn't be interesting. It would simply be another drug-induced or facilitated state. But William James, in a brilliant move in the Varieties, wrote what for many is a definitive chapter, arguing against what he called medical materialism, arguing that you could not refute an experience by identifying what you think are the proximate conditions that facilitate it. So James said, for instance, if mad people have mystical experiences, it doesn't mean they're not mad, but it doesn't tell you anything about the value and ontological validity of the experience. You judge the experience, not by its origins, but by its roots. So as the drug revolution reached the streets, the best example, history that is written by a guy named Stevens called Storm in Heaven. There was a turning east, people having these experiences and wondering what they're about. And the psychologist said, you're going mad, these are psychomimetic drugs, all that kind of stuff. And the churches opposed that as artificially elicited states of consciousness. So the drug people turned east. They turned to explore Hinduism, Buddhism, where all of these experiences that were triggered by drugs were common, and they were not drug dependent. So what happened was there was a man named Timothy Leary. His reputation has been deservedly tarnished. But you need to go back and read the literatures of the 60s, because Timothy Leary was recruited to Harvard University to solve a problem. And that is the problem that he was to solve was the failure of psychotherapy. How did people get into these ruts and unable to get out of them? And Timothy Leary said what they need to do is be able to reframe the world, to see the world differently. But how do you see the world differently? How can you do it? And he said, here's what we need to do. We need to use these substances, not because they're interesting biochemically, although they are, not because they alter your brain, although they do, but because they seem to be useful for some people to alter the way they see the world. And when they see the world in this altered way, they are confronting something that has ontological validity. They get out of their rut. So here's what he did. He worked with a brilliant student named Pankey. And Pankey had a medical degree, had a theology degree, and was Timothy Leary's best PhD student. And they designed this experiment, which now is being replicated at Johns Hopkins University. I'm going to give you the experiment, I'm going to give you the replication, and we'll end. The experiment was very simple. He said, let's take people who are in a rush, who have these profound experiences that they recognize, and let's compare them to people who don't. Now, we know the people that have these profound experiences because they're found within the great faith traditions, these people that report and indeed have mystical experiences. But what about people who don't? So he said, let's take people who don't have those experiences but should. So he designed an experiment called the Good Friday experiment, which was his PhD thesis. It's also called the Miracle of Marsh Chapel, even it's called many things. But here's what he did. He decided to take Protestant seminary students. These are people who are going to seminary, so have strong, profound religious beliefs about the world that we could debate forever. So, you know, again, if people are debating theological beliefs, religious beliefs, you have yours, you walk aside. But he said, what if we could do something? What if we could take them to a significant event? So he said, let's do something. Let's design this experiment where they go and hear a sermon on Good Friday. So these are Protestant seminary students, right? They're going to hear a sermon on Good Friday, and the person preaching the sermon was a brilliant man, the same man who taught Martin Luther King to preach. So that they're going to hear this profoundly moving sermon dealing with the death and resurrection, right? And here's what we're going to do. Half of them are going to be given psilocybin, essentially for all purposes, LSD. The other half are going to be given a double-blind control. And the people who are given psilocybin will be assigned two guides, one who doesn't take the psilocybin, and the other who does take psilocybin. And all they're going to do is listen to a Good Friday sermon. And then we're going to see what happens. All kinds of problems with the study, but let me summarize it real quick. What happens is the people who took psilocybin had the most profoundly moving experience of their lives. They also, on measures akin to my mysticism scale, scored extremely high. Those who didn't take mysticism, the psilocybin, and didn't score high on the mystic kind of measures, either didn't have a significant experience, simply had a meaningful experience, because after all, it's about the resurrection of God, Jesus, their beliefs, or they were totally distraught and disorganized. They could not frame it effectively. So, the follow-up of that study was done 20 years later. They took the people who had this profoundly moving experience, were able to reassess them, and these were people who had stayed within their faith, developed their faith, precisely because the content of their beliefs now matched the way they experienced and knew the world to be. So now there's a man that's doing something amazingly profound, I'll make it short, at Johns Hopkins University. His name is Griffith, and he's funded by the Council on Spiritual Practices. And what he's trying to do, and he has the studies now published, is to use psilocybin in order to take people who are lacking in their faith and give them experiences that renew their faith by eliciting and facilitating mystical states of consciousness. Now, Griffith is important for two reasons, and I'll quit. He's a world authority on two drugs, mysticism, okay, with psilocybin, and caffeine. Now, the reason I like to mention caffeine is most of you know about caffeine, right? And you know that caffeine is a drug, but there are no drug-specific effects that you would attribute to caffeine that would invalidate any kind of experience. If I said to you, I went to Starbucks and got some Juan Valdez tequila and then saw God, what would you say? Oh, I'm glad you saw God, whatever that means and stuff, but I don't think it was caused by coffee. And most of you use coffee like as a generalized beta enhancer, right? You use it because it makes you awake. And then what you do when you're awake has nothing to do with the drug, right? But if you drink coffee and you study chemistry and get an A on your chemistry exam, I shouldn't say I need a urine test, right? And then I said, I'm going to fail you because you have like drug-enhanced performance. You say, no, I took caffeine and then I studied hard and I did well. Somebody else is really dumb, says, well, I won't study chemistry, I'll just drink caffeine. You say, that won't work. Right? So here's what we know from the Good Friday experience. Mystical states are universal. They are embedded in all the great faith traditions. The language of the faith traditions is not restricted to that, but it exists because that experience exists. And that experience can be facilitated by a wide variety of means. I've done it in setting in congruity, sensory isolation, psilocybin, prayer, meditation. It doesn't make any difference. But when that experience occurs, it is the fuel that gives the lived dimension to a faith tradition, which is inevitably linked back not to simple beliefs that run dry, but to experiences that are embedded in your very nature that you are assured to have, if you like, in my phrase, a sense of ontological validity, because they elicit in you a sense of ontological wonder that occurs when the self dissolves and is merged into a greater reality it is made aware of. Thank you.